Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this fireside chat on digital assets. It's a pleasure to have you back here. Today we have a special guest, Maximilian Forster, co-founder of CashOnLedger, and I would like to welcome him. Hi, Maximilian. Welcome.
Hi, Francesco. Hi, EY team. Happy to be here and share some insights about digital assets and the future of digital asset business models.
It's our pleasure to have you here. I remember also the last time we met was a couple of months ago, where you were actually coming out of the FinTech Germany awards with your own award in your hands, and next to you there was the other co-founder. But maybe before we start dealing about these aspects, why don't you tell us a little bit more about how the two of you met and how the idea of founding CashOnLedger came out, and elaborate on this a little bit.
Yes. So basically what we have been doing is we have been asking ourselves the question, like at the end of 2019, can we program money? Because ultimately, we've been following the blockchain space for a period of time until then, and we've been following it quite closely. And for us, it was always this open question of, like, holistically speaking, like, what can you use the technology for? So what is it actually good for? And what is actually, like, the benefit and the value you get from it? And asking ourselves this question, we derived like basically two particular value incentives and values out of the technology. One of them being IoT payments. So as you might know, some cryptocurrencies already around the world say that they offer machine-to-machine payments, Internet of Things payments. So basically everything which is connected to data that basically robots can pay themselves in one of the later stage developments. And this is one of the directions which we have been following. And the other one is ultimately following the market need of cryptocurrencies in a sense that they are a new digital asset class. Boiling it down, from our perspective, it was very intriguing to have a technology not being hosted by cryptocurrencies, but triggering discussion there, that you basically have like a programmatic scheme in existing money. So in existing commercial bank money, which you have, that you can basically program a function, which, for example, is that the postman arrives at your doorstep at 11, and then he gets 10 euros. He arrives at 12, and he gets only 8. That's one of these typical if then else functions, which we all know from coding. And this is something which we found particularly interesting and where we wanted to build a business around, which we did with CashOnLedger, and where we focusing on pay-per-use business models. And both of us have been at Accenture, and throughout the time, obviously, being technology focused and basically starting to derive the value from blockchain.
Very good. And this is how everything started, right? And as I mentioned before, we met a couple of months ago, and now we are having this fireside chat. What actually happened in between? What were the major milestones of your company?
Yes. So obviously, as we started, we needed to learn a lot of things. So because programmable money is one side of the coin, but it's rather more important to also particularly if you look at it lower functions, but they become if you're detail oriented and if you really want to bring use cases live, they become pretty much necessary and pretty much in focus. This is billing, invoicing, ERP integration, and all of these things which are actually necessary in order to produce invoices and basically transactions out of movement and IoT data. And having said that, obviously we had a steep learning curve by founding the company in 2020. Then already getting our first client in March, where we basically founded the company as well, and then start with the client implementation work. So we took half a year of a pilot, and then after a year we already have the use case live. So what we've did with Lindner tractors, this pay-per-use logic, where you have a tractor and you only pay what you use the tractor for. Basically, we'd implemented this logic and brought it live within 1 year. And after this year, obviously, we had a steep learning curve because what we've developed for Lindner might not be suitable for other clients. And in order to have a scalable product, we needed to withdraw some functions and tweak a little bit the product. So ultimately, we derived a fully scalable product which can be implemented in almost every industry. And it was a long way because obviously, we needed to shift up with the tech. So we needed the technology to be rebuilt. We actually did that 3 times in order to have a scalable system ultimately.
Amazing. And maybe going back to a couple of points that you mentioned, you talked about one client, about one use case, but why not elaborating a little bit more about your target group of customers that you have, and especially the value that you're bringing to them? Us that there was this learning curve that you went through. So what is the outcome of that? What is the real value that CashOnLedger is bringing now to the future customer?
Yes. So basically what we do is we are the technological bridge between industry and finance. And what we do is we enable our customers to basically deploy data-driven business models. What does that mean directly? It means basically that if you have any kind of paper use, a classic business model from pure sales. For example, you as an OEM, you produce a tractor or you produce any kind of machinery, which is, it could be, I think, from laser 3D printing or anything else, or even you're a medical producer of medical devices, you're pulling it, and you want to turn your business from pure sales to a kind of a as logic, so software service logic, just in that sense as an asset as a service logic. So you transform your one-time of sales into monthly recurring revenue streams. That's where CashOnLedger comes in. And we transform basically the existing B2B infrastructure where people usually buy things or even lease things. We transform that into usage-based business models. They can really derive out of the data which we retrieve from the several sensors in these assets, so in these vehicles, machines. We derive financial data and turn this financial data into transactions ultimately to get also together with our partners to finally also settle these invoices and basically create a full automated cycle in order to enable asset as a service in this full scale for the German and particularly the European as well as the worldwide industry.
Maybe using the example that you mentioned before, the one with the tractors that you were highlighting previously, can you tell us exactly how did it work? What did you do? How everything was set up? So maybe just for us to better understand what is behind the scenes, so to say.
Yes. So basically, you need to imagine yourself try to imagine you're a kind of mid-sized family-owned company in Austria. You're the last one producing tractors in a sense that you're the last kind of farmer-oriented OEM in whole of Austria. And obviously you face big competition. Like Lindner itself, being Lindner Tractors, they have 400 employees. They have a turnover, they turn around 1,400 vehicles per year. This might be the daily production of, for example, John Deere or Massey Ferguson, all of the bigger players. So ultimately, you're in a highly competitive environment. And this highly competitive environment ultimately results in you asking yourself the question, what is my specific unique selling proposition? And what is actually my niche, which I can operate in? And for that specific reason, David and Hermann Lindner basically figured out that particularly the rental business is very much something which they like. So, and with that, and their niche, and with that niche scoped, they really wanted to figure out how can we make rentals basically being existing or being fundamental business model extension for us, and how can we actually make it profitable? Because ultimately, if you look at the rental, which is currently which was currently performed by Lindner beforehand, they actually had the issue that due to the manual processes being involved in all of that steps, that they basically created a high cost load. And in order to basically turn down the cost load to profit from the vehicles, you need to automate a lot of things. But you also, and that's where CashOnLedger comes in, you need to start using the IoT data in order to transform the different usage scenarios into actual money. So what do I mean with that? Basically what we do and what we help Lindner with is ultimately they have IoT data, telemetric data already being existent on the tractors. We take this data and based on rules, the business logic, what we call it, from Lindner, we implement several usage scenarios. One of them, for example, is that if you deploy a salt spreader or not. So is there anything of equipment being deployed to a vehicle? Yes or no? If yes, you pay a higher hourly rate than if you would not deploy any kind of equipment. Another one is the turnarounds per minute from the machine itself. To what kind of are you using the tractor for? So do you use it for example, to go up a steep hill? Then obviously the vehicle is more devalued than if you would just use it on a plain normal street. And all of that we derive out of the data. We transform this data then automatically into bills where we say, hey, customer, you've been using the tractors in like driving 2 hours to your basically farm or to your basic field, which you want to operate in. And then once the farmer goes into the field and puts in heavy work, what we call usage scenario in that sense, once he uses the tractor, he basically pays more. And with that simple separation, ultimately, you get a price distinction. And also, you have a better overview of the devaluation of the asset and the depreciation. Because ultimately, if you use the tractor more heavy, then the depreciation is heavier, ultimately. So if you look at that from a holistic perspective, what was important for Lindner is that we have this IoT data and transform this IoT data from the vehicles into specific outcomes and specific bills and invoicing, ultimately creating a value for Lindner.
So leveraging the use of IoT in order to have a new business model in place, using your technology and your knowledge. But you also mentioned IoT data as one key component of it. So what other cases there could be in the future? I mean, I assume that you're not going to work only on tractors going forward. Maybe also because there are not hundreds of thousands of Lindner outside there. But IoT is something that will impact many other sectors. So what are the other use cases? What are the other sectors or elements that you are focusing on going forward?
So what we're currently working on particular is neighboring industries, which we have, for example, with hydrogen lorries, which we currently use, lorries, which we currently use, and figure out that this is a particular next use case. Why is that? If you look at the hydrogen lorry infrastructure currently, if you compare it to a normal lorry, you would actually pay 5 times the price. So if you look at the normal transporter and lorry, you would pay 100,000 euros. If you go for a hydrogen one, you pay 600,000 euros. So you can already see this initial investment is pretty much critical, particularly looking at the logistics and transporting industry. Having analyzed that, obviously there is a lack. That's why not many logistic companies invest in hydrogen lorries, because ultimately they face the issue of technological uncertainty. They don't know whether hydrogen plays the role it should play. They face the lack of infrastructure. So if they would invest in one of the lorries, there's still not the necessary infrastructure for that. So basically having a pay-per-use model where you only pay what you use the lorry for is way better for them, because then they don't need to bear this high investment costs. And what we figured out is that a lot of OEM companies, so the ones who basically issue the transport offer, so all of discounters, but also automotive OEMs, they all put a lot of focus on environmental stable logistic transports. And that's why they have a focus on if somebody's using a hydrogen transporter, they're even willing to pay a bigger price and a higher price than if you would just transport it normal with gas. So that's one of the use cases which we currently operate. But there's also other ones which I already outlined in the beginning, where we have 3D printers, so a very high tech product, which ultimately also is very pricey, particularly for smaller manufacturers. So that's why they also didn't want to buy or bear this high initial investment cost, but rather try it out and see whether they have a market. Why is that? Ultimately, they face the insecurity of, do I get enough offers, and do I get enough proposals and enough orders in order to make this machine rent itself? So basically, to basically reach the ROI with a 3D printer. And in order to overcome that hurdle, you can decrease this initial investment cost and minimize it in a sense that you just rent it out, and whenever you're using it, you pay more than if you would not use it. So that's the rationale between the 3D printers, but even goes as far as medical devices, or medical device equipment manufacturer. They ask themselves the question how can we basically put more of the more costly devices into the market? Thinking of CT scanners, thinking of MRT scanners, they're pretty expensive, also for local hospitals. And in order to basically achieve that, you can basically buy buy the latest version, which is then also more healthy, or and sometimes better for the patient. In order to get these devices, you basically need to also have a new financing model, but the hospital doesn't need to bear all the costs, because putting €1 million or €1.5 million for a CT scanner, which is a regular price, is quite a large sum, particularly small hospitals. And this is like use cases which you currently operate, but there's also like other ones in mechanical engineering where we have like, kind of several other use cases like forklifts, for example, or even like other use cases which we currently discuss in order to basically see whether they have value for the OEMs and whether they are like interested in that business model.
Absolutely, and I assume going forward things might still look a little bit different, and many possibilities as well as challenges might appear. But what I understand also from your discussion is the fact that if I summarize all these use cases, they can all be gathered around the topic of tokenizing real assets somehow, or through the use of blockchain, supporting digitalization, supporting the proper financing or use of these assets, eventually even through pay-per-use models, which will drastically change some of these investments into this large manufacturing products. But this is, of course, only one category among the digital assets, right? So the tokenized estates or tokenized, let's put it this way, manufactured assets, so to say. There are, of course, other asset classes that go from, the classical cryptocurrencies, if you want to include, to private money or public money, and eventually also including other ones. Now, in this plethora of possible assets that are coming into the market, what is your view? How do you see the development of them going forward?
Maybe to comment a little bit on the tokenized industrial goods, which we just have been discussing. So just in order to blow away a little bit of the fog, which is currently residing in the industry, at least from my feeling, is that ultimately having a look at it really from a strategic and holistic perspective. Like what we can see is that tokenization, and there's a lot of people running around saying tokenization is the truth and tokenization will do everything. Well, basically it's not. Ultimately, you need to transform, you need to do the work in order to transform the industrial goods into profit centers. So mapping cash flows onto these assets is the first crucial necessary step in order to basically transform the good into a financial good. So this asset into a financial asset. Without doing so, there's no need for tokenization, because if you don't map any cash flow, you don't have any profits and not any costs. And if you can't compare profit and costs, how do you actually measure whether an asset is worth of investing or not? So ultimately, this is just a basic fundamental step in order to have tokenized industrial goods. And then you also need to ask yourself the question of the tokenization itself, whether it's necessary for industrial goods, because ultimately you need to have a strong comparison between, for example, securitization, which is the typical way, because you always need to have a kind of legal basis, a legal structure, a foundation may book these assets into, because ultimately one must, somebody, at least in this cycle, must own these assets, whether it be the customer or the OEM or the bank. Somebody always has it on their balance sheet. And this is necessary because an asset can't own an asset. So after the German law, no thing can own a thing. There's always a private or legal entity owning things. And that's basically one of the foundations. And then you need to ask yourself the question whether a tokenization of these assets would make sense, and what is the several steps of making them or bringing sense into this game. This should, as first, this perspective, I'm more than happy to jump more into this discussion. Ultimately, I see digital assets on the rise still, because ultimately, we are more entering the digitized world, and we basically started off with that discussion of pay-per-use and this whole profit center discussion you just had. Is basically, you digitize kind of financial information, and then obviously you need to display it in a different way, and that's for digital assets. And Bitcoin is for me the first native digital asset. Just open up this whole discussion, and then obviously transforming into NFTs, what we currently see run up curve where you have several kind of goods and digital art and digital, basically intellectual property, just in a digitized form. And then running up to commercialized goods and tokenized industrial goods. So I see a run up curve currently, but there must also always be this critical question to ask, where does it make sense? Because tokenization is only the tool, and you need to ask yourself the question, what do you want to use the tool for? Where does it actually bring you a solution?
Or as we say this differently, technology alone will not make you successful, or the use of technology alone will not make you successful. You need to have the right business model behind or the right use of it in order to enable you to be successful. But going back to some of the points that you mentioned, I would like to focus maybe on one specific class of digital assets that we did not touch much in details up to now, which is institutional money, if you would like to define it this way, and specifically central bank digital currencies. I mean, we have heard a lot of what is happening around with many central banks trying to understand whether this is the way going forward, whether could be something that we should eventually, as an institution, I would say, implement, or they should implement in this case. But my question is exactly, how do you see this development? I mean, at the end of the day, will we see every central bank in the future, issuing their own digital currency, or do you see any change into this, or specifically, what is your take?
Very good question. And I think there's also a lot of fog around this topic because you also need to clear that steam up, I would say, and literally separate it. So basically, what do we have in common with the central bank digital currency or this whole digital euro discussion? Ultimately, this paper use case with programmatic money in that sense is the basis for basically a scream from the industry towards the financial institutions. Hey, we need to alter the way we transfer money from today. So we always bring this use case to the table and discuss with several institutional banks and also regulators, as well as ECB and so on and so forth. Several kind of opportunities there. What I see personally is a separation between two topics, and one of them being CBDC, as you just outlined, central bank digital currency, because a central bank digital currency follows an entire different kind of design principle than what we need for programmatic schemes. And a CBDC must be a kind of an extension to what we call cash, and must be an extension for all basically citizens in order to have a digital form of money, which is basically state represented. So ultimately, you just create a digital form of cash, because what you see in your current wallet, or if you go into your online banking, is basically commercial bank money, and that means nothing else than what the bank owes you or what you have access to. So that's not kind of a central bank money, and that's the huge difference. The only central bank money you have access to is the one which you have in the wallet. So, and that's why central bank digital currency must follow an entirely different approach, and whether DLT can or should be or specifically tokens are a subsidiary of that and must be implemented there is a whole different discussion, because you need to follow different design principles. So putting that aside, looking at again the private space and the private sector space with commercial bank money, therefore there must be an innovation, and this innovation must be triggered by the Bank Association and the Credit Association of Germany, so Deutsche Kreditwirtschaft, in that sense, because there must be a standardization and a fungibility made, and design principles and design architecture made for enabling these use cases. Bringing you a tangible example of that, think about a tractor, and this tractor basically having a flat tire. If you have this flat tire, then you need to have obviously insurance being involved in the case, and insurance must cover up for your losses, because ultimately you can't use the tractor, but you should still pay for it, and so on and so forth. A typical insurance claim. If you want to automate that whole process, there must be a function telling a system hey, the tractor has a flat tire. And if the tractor has a flat tire, please send money from the insurance company to basically the insuree, so basically the user of the tractor, that he gets reimbursed for the loss he had. And that's basically one of the examples where you need to have programmatic scheme, because ultimately with that function of a flat tire, that's an event, and this event must trigger the function of a reverse money stream. And this bidirectional money stream is not replicated in the current payment systems. And that's where programmatic payments must tackle in. And that's where tokenized commercial bank money will play a role. Or even in the current state, what they call trigger solutions, where you have an interface, whether it be token-based or smart contract-based, is up for discussion still, but you still have kind of a trigger for an event, which then triggers a normal bank transaction.
So sticking for 1 second to the point that you just mentioned about these payments that can be programmable, or programmable money, let's put it this way. You mentioned or you highlighted how this, with the example that you shown, could actually support a complete new way of dealing with the assets themselves. But going forward, is this something that we will see just linked to, for instance, these kind of specific cases, or what is the future of programmable money anyway?
So basically, if you think that further, there's this ghost always wandering around the room where you have people telling there's going to be autonomous driving cars and this car is going to pay for themselves. Well, if you want to put that into reality, first of all, again, you need to measure the profitability of these assets, wandering around, going around and see. And then you obviously need to have this programmatic payment streams. So what you basically enable that, what I want to say is that these programmatic payments are the basis for IoT payments and are the basis for machine-to-machine payments. There is no need for real-time payments because ultimately machines can also wait and consolidate for 2 weeks or even a month. That's not a big deal. And that was never a big deal in the B2B world. But ultimately, if you want to really automate all of these use cases and really want to deploy machine-to-machine payments, this is necessary. You need to have a programmable payment base, because of that programmable payment base, a thing or a car or an asset or anything else can basically decide and knows when it should release some money and when it should get some money. And that's definitely something which is the fundamental basis of a more and more autonomous society and a more and more autonomous world. Speaking of the future, speaking of right now, as just bringing it back to the very family-owned business in Austria, the more you can automate, the less people you basically need to deploy for these cases, and the more the higher profits you get from the business model. Having worked with Lindner and having seen their struggle in manual process work, which was necessary in order to rent vehicles, and having really see what they basically get out of their business model right now, as they just have been following the path with us, and creating more and more revenue streams, because with time, with more and more time, you automate more and more functions. But that single steps, the profitability increases, and thinking from this perspective, obviously there will more companies follow. And follow down that path and increasing their profitability, altering or even extending their own business model. And with that, basically you enable a future sustainable growth, because you're then in the in the world of digitization, and for the first time basically make use of IoT data instead of only replaying it in kind of any form of statistical data.
And I found it interesting that you also mentioned there is no need for having instant payments into this field, because if machines can settle their payments or their transactions in 2 weeks, this is actually not altering the functioning of them or the system itself. But of course, this will bring other consequences. The need to have a very good clearinghouse able to manage all these transactions at one point. At the same time, there is, of course, some risks involved into this, because there is the counterparty risk in this delay of the settlement. My assumption here is that, of course, this is something that will need to be validated in a cost analysis, in a cost-benefit analysis. But of course, you're right. It's the beginning, right? It's the start, and then of course on this you might build them. So maybe talking also about the future and switching a little bit the topic and thinking about. New trends or new hypes, depends how people will see that into the world. Everything that you are talking about has some connection with the real world, right? With the real assets or industrial goods, as you mentioned before. How about the metaverse? How could this work in the metaverse, or what do you think about the future of the metaverse will be, and what kind of role maybe CashOnLedger could play on that?
So basically looking at the metaverse, ultimately you basically create a full digitized world, and for digitized you need digital native tools. So it doesn't really make much sense in order to have kind of a semi-digital tool, being deployed in a metaverse. Particularly looking at it from the perspective of Meta itself, the company basically started off with creating an own financial services entity. And having that, already showcases that there is the need for new payment functionalities, particularly being native online. So you don't want to have cash, because how would you put cash in a metaverse? So ultimately you need to create a function where you have again, this programmability, or at least this ease of transferability of money, being deployed online and being a kind of a digital native tool in that sense. So having said that, obviously that is one of the cases. looking further, like what I think what will remain, because like we also see a lot of hype around this topic, and we also see a lot of hype around the NFT topic. Like I think what I think will remain is ultimately real assets, like and their digital form and their digital twin, and not only their digital twin but also their financial digital twin, because that's what opened up like kind of like an entirely new kind of asset class where people can basically invest their money in, and that's something which really like is on the doorstep. Metaverse will definitely develop into the same direction, and at one point we will definitely like also have like kind of like a digital like kind of digital twin of the real world called the metaverse, where we basically started off with like having native digital currencies like wandering around there, because it's obviously like not not regulated at the current stage, but definitely will be, and like it will gain more and more traction in the future, and I will definitely see like a kind of a mix between the both worlds, and would actually see like the deployment again of like payments is always something which is like declaring and like kind of like shifting money from point A to point B, and this will always be necessary because ultimately nothing else can be paid for, and if nothing can be paid for, then it's nice to look at, but you would not actually be able to spend money on it.
But either we go back to barter deals as we did hundreds of thousands or thousands of years ago, but I do not see this eventually taking place in the short term here. And let's see what the future will reserve for us. Maximilian, I think we are at the end of this interview. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. And thank you all for watching us.
Thank you.